So the reason I had you make this qualifiers list by category is because it gives you some of the content and information that you can begin to use to food chain. If you remember from the example that I showed with my combination cards of where we changed the color, the shape, the taste, the texture, or the temperature, you can see how these are identifying factors or qualifying factors that your child loves and sees as familiar and preferred with the foods that they love. And so as you begin to change one of these, you can begin to see very easy, very straightforward ways to begin to food chain from where you're starting. So we're going to go ahead and review a few of the techniques that are used within food chaining and outlined from the resource that had been suggested so that you understand a little bit more about a few different directions that food chaining can take. Again, food chaining can go different directions at different paces depending on your child's preferences, and how they take to different steps throughout this process. I just wanted to go ahead and review these for you so that you know flavor mapping is not a technical term that you need to commit to memory. However, if you do want to do additional research on any of the techniques that you hear me talk about, you would find these as familiar techniques and terms that are used throughout the research, but also throughout different resources such as this food chaining book that I'd shared, for you to be able to go ahead and research those a little bit more on your own. Additionally, if you're working with a feeding therapist, these are techniques that you might want to discuss with them to see if they're already using them, and maybe they just hadn't identified them by name to use specifically, so that you can see if they're using them, and if so, how you might be able to also use them at home, so you can try the techniques that are being used in therapy as techniques also to translate into the home environment. So with that, to go ahead and get talking about the technique of flavor mapping, this is where we kind of map the flavors that your child seems to enjoy. And these are those foods that your child tends to choose and to accept, and to use what we know about those foods, those qualifying factors, to find more foods with similar flavors. So I tend to stick to the word taste here, but taste and flavor are used interchangeably. And so if you see that your child really loves salty foods or has a strong preference for salt, you can begin to see that it would make more sense for you to begin food chaining foods that also have a very salty taste, rather than saying going the direction of like sweeter foods. That just tells you a little bit more about the flavors your child tends to enjoy. The same sort of thing of if your child likes the flavor or the taste of cinnamon, and you see this with some of the foods that you listed out qualifiers for, you would know that if they really enjoy the taste of cinnamon, maybe I can try cinnamon in different applications, whether it be cinnamon rolls, cinnamon twists, cinnamon Pop-Tarts. These are all examples that come from the food chaining book. I know you might be thinking, really, Ashley, did we pay to be in the academy to see you encourage us to eat our child, or to get our child to eat cinnamon rolls and cinnamon twists and cinnamon Pop-Tarts? Hopefully you know that is of course not the case. However, if you can see these as links on a chain to a greater outcome of greater nutritional variety in terms of the number of foods your child is willing to accept, we can continue to expand towards more nutrient-dense options. However, if there's very few items that your child will even enjoy and eat, it gives us a lot bigger challenge in terms of how we can leverage that for greater nutrition. So if you can see this as part of the process, hopefully you can see how this can start to pique some ideas about different things. It might also be as simple as you sprinkle some cinnamon on apple slices and you give them that cinnamon flavor. You're flavor mapping that they enjoy cinnamon, and you're helping use that flavor to help create a food chain between a cinnamon product that maybe they already prefer and something like apples. Additionally, if you want to sprinkle cinnamon on yogurt or on oatmeal, those would probably be some of the examples I would give, but I wanted to share a few that came out of the context of this resource because they have several really helpful examples of flavor mapping and just food chaining in general throughout this book that I thought I would go ahead and share. Another technique that's often used in food chaining is the technique known as flavor masking. Again, you don't need to commit these terms to memory, but so that you can understand a little bit more of this conceptually as you begin to think through how you could food chain some of your own child's love-it foods to leverage those into potentially exposing them to new foods, but also helping them to tolerate new foods. And flavor masking is something that parents do all the time without knowing this as a formal technique. And that's when we use a condiment or a sauce to help mask the taste of a new food. And so for kids, condiments like ranch or ketchup are very common ones. Some kids might go so far as to do like a barbecue sauce, or if they have a favorite dipping sauce at a fast food restaurant or something like that, they may be more willing to try a new food because they have that condiment and sauce as a conduit of helping mask the taste of the item itself. So same sort of thing if we were trying to get our child to learn to like broccoli and we knew they loved ranch, broccoli may be better received if they had the condiment of ranch to help mask the broccoli's flavor. And so we can gradually kind of decrease the amount of sauce that's available or offered or needed. Some kids might need copious amounts of it to tolerate the food at first, but then be willing and able to enjoy the food with less amounts over time. But the idea is that we get to gradually expose our child to more of the flavor of the learning it food or the next food that we're trying to expose them to through this condiment or sauce. Some kids are not into condiments or sauces at all, especially if they don't like mixed textures or things like that. Some children may completely just not use them for any food or their love it food in general, in which case flavor masking obviously becomes a little bit more limited. But I also want to encourage you to kind of think outside the box in terms of things like applesauce and yogurt. Having your child dip things in applesauce or dip things in yogurt, if those are preferred love it foods for them, can also be used in this way to help expose them to more variety through whatever that dipper is that they're using for these items. Something else you might be able to identify from your child's love it list and the qualifiers that go with it is something for a transitional food. If there is a known love it food that helps your child to transition to something new, this might be offered in between bites and kind of offered as a way that might cleanse their palate or reduce the aftertaste of the given food that they're trying. So, some of these staples that often get a bad rap, like bread or chips at the table or something like that with some of these meals, can be offered as something that minimizes the taste of the new food and redirects it towards a food that we know they prefer. So say you're having Mexican and there's chips there. If your child is trying something new and they know they have chips, this can be used as a transitional food that helps them transition between whatever new element they're trying at the meal and yet helps kind of neutralize their taste to something that they know they prefer in between bites. Another technique that can be used with food chaining that comes from the food chaining book resource as well is something known as surprise foods. And so this would be not something that necessarily falls within your child's particular food chain, but it's just a surprise element that you're exposing your child to as something that's a novel and new option that they get to experience with no pressure to eat, but that they get to just find as something that they're interested in or potentially get excited about, and something that is intended to kind of be a fun food that kind of brings back the enjoyment of eating and the pleasurable activity that eating can be, rather than part of just your routine and the structure that you already have in place. This could be something that your child helps prepare, and so they get to experience being involved in it and handling it and experiencing the more sensory components of the food and understanding it and learning to like it away from the table itself. It might also be something that the way they position it in the food chaining resource is maybe it's something that you let them know about in advance. You're not necessarily surprising it on them the way we talked about in Module 5, where if you change a texture on your child and you add in a surprise element, that can shut them down a little bit, and we touch on that a little bit later in this module as well. This is used surprise in a pleasant, fun, inviting sense that you might kind of invite it as like a surprise guest, and maybe you kind of position it as like a 20 questions of it's like hidden under a box or a towel or a hat or something like that, and you kind of help your child to learn this new friend based off 20 questions. Like, ask me questions of what you think it is, and you try and get towards guessing what it might be, and then you bring it out. Again, this might be something like a new dessert that they've never had, and it doesn't necessarily have a place on their food chain, but it helps them to see that this is a fun food. It's completely different from all the qualifiers that they have for their usual Love It foods, but it helps them to branch out just the same. So as mentioned on these slides, none of these are intended to be done contradictory to the division of responsibility. So if you find yourself seeing these techniques and seeing that in doing so you might feel the inclination to pressure your child or bribe your child or push too hard in a way that could compromise the feeding relationship, I would encourage you to pause, because that's not the aim or the intent out of any of these techniques being used within food chaining. If you look at some of the approaches that can be used in feeding therapy, some can be more pressure-based. However, sticking just to speaking about food chaining is often done in therapy as well. And so again, as mentioned, if any of these techniques are ones that interest you, or you might have thought your child's feeding therapist is using, if that's already a service that you're seeking out, I would encourage you to ask them about that. With that, I also want to give you a little bit of a scope of what might be most common and appropriate in a therapy setting versus what you can still achieve and work towards doing with food chaining at home. In therapy, food chaining is often a much more involved process that involves several links to the food chain to expand on one given food using hierarchies that connect a wide range of foods. For the scope of the academy and the group nature that we're in, without me being able to individually assess each of you and understand each of your child's qualifying lists, we aren't able to go into that complexity here. However, I will provide some example chains for you to see so that you can better understand what I'm talking about. However, when we're talking about using food chaining at home, you want to consider how you can simplify the steps so that you can bring slow, gradual growth in the right direction without feeling like pressure needs to be used. This might include simple tools like the Dr. Yum score or the Love It Like It Learning It taste card that are provided either in the Academy notebook for the taste test card, or the Dr. Yum score is included as a suggested reference for this module. But each of these will give you more simple scales if you want to help your child participate in kind of how they rate their experience. This rating system, as mentioned in therapy, is going to be a little bit more robust and often maybe be like a 10-point scale, where the scales for at-home use might just be like a 3-point scale, like the Love It Like It Learning It taste test card, or the Dr. Yum score, which would be like a 5-point scorecard. And this just helps you to understand how your child's responding to that, again, so that you can be responsive with how you then continue the food chain after that. If you see that your child's shutting down and very averse to what's being offered, you might choose, how can I take this food chain in a different direction? Again, there's a lot of different directions you can take this, so some of this information can be helpful in redirecting you as the parent if you're doing this at home, and how to be most successful with food chaining moving forward. So for a very simple example of what food chaining might look like, I want to go ahead and share with you this visual that comes from the occupational and feeding therapists over at Our Table Eating in Color. I included the Instagram handle here so you can see, and I'll also include them in the suggested resources this week because they have some great content on Instagram, but also on their blog. And I know we'll touch upon it as well in upcoming modules as we talk about learning to like new foods. But in the context of food chaining, I want to go ahead and show you here because I think it's a great graphic to understand how they kind of take this ballpark hot dog, this starting Love It food, and begin to think of how can they food chain this. This is a very simple food chain, but this is where I would encourage you to begin thinking how you can begin to make, again, that one small change. What is a change small enough that they won't care, but large enough that they'll notice something is different? What we want to be doing here is helping your child become comfortable with that small change. We want to develop a sense of safety and security for them with foods being offered in a new way so that they don't shut down or become anxious over these differences, but rather that they see these are small, subtle changes I can tolerate and I can learn to like and ultimately enjoy. So with something like changing it to a turkey dog, maybe they notice that the taste is a little different, or a chicken dog, if the color is a little bit off of their kind of original preferred food. Maybe you change the shape and you slice a Polish hot dog for a dinner one night, or you might change the size and offer a little smoky so they see, again, a lot of similarities to their original Love It food, but it's different. And so again, is the goal to be getting our children to eat more hot dogs? No, not necessarily, but I want you to see with some very common examples and very valid, valuable starting places that we see a lot of kids starting out at, so that you see anywhere that you are starting, we can begin to make small steps in the right direction so that we continue to add more tolerance to more foods, which gets us to our greater end goal of more nutritional variety. For a much more robust example of food chaining, I wanted to share another image that came from the feeding therapist at Our Table Eating in Color that I show here, and I'll include it in the suggested resources as well, because you can go to it and you can see the actual language that they would use down where the purple script is on this one. In this particular post, they share how you would verbalize these similarities to your child. Again, this is a gift, and this is something that they do with their clients in person often, and so it becomes much more natural and much easier for them to transition children from one link to the next in a food chain. As you develop some comfort with this, as you develop a little bit greater sense of competency towards being able to make some of these connections, I encourage you to think through if and how you want to make a longer food chain. Feeding therapists will often use a hierarchy like this to kind of move from a pancake, say, to raw cauliflower, whereas parents, it might be very difficult for a parent to think, how do I connect these two? And even with seeing these examples, how you transition and how you do so in a way that isn't pressuring or isn't forcing, but that's really playful and really inviting for your child. So I encourage you to go check out this resource for a little bit more context, but I wanted to show it here because I wanted to show you, again, to the point of, are we really just offering a cinnamon Pop-Tart because my child likes cinnamon? Or are we really just offering a different kind of hot dog because my child likes hot dogs? That is, of course, not what I'm emphasizing and not what my end goal is for you and your families. But instead, I think that this portrays a great example of how, as we make some of these small changes, your child can begin to connect the dots of how these foods all work together. So I'm going to walk through this example in a little bit more depth, and then also give you some insight on maybe how you could use this, or maybe a modified version, even if you just did, maybe the first half one time and then the second half a second time, so you could begin to see how this longer food chain session could work. So with the example of the Love It food of a pancake, offering it in its normal form the first time, and then maybe the second time what you're doing is you're connecting the same item, but you're presenting it with a new shape. And then the next time you would be keeping the shape the same, but you would be presenting a new food with a tortilla. The next step, you would be presenting the same item, but it would have cheese inside. So you can see how that would change some of the taste and the texture of it. Then the next step, you might be presenting the same item just in a new way, because it's still the quesadilla as with the former link, but now it's opened up so your kid can see some of the different sensory components that are different versus the original quesadilla idea. And then from there, with the shredded mozzarella cheese, you might see we're offering cheese again, but now it's in a new form. And moving from the shredded cheese into a cauliflower rice, we're connecting that they're very similar in shape and color and size, even though their taste and their texture is different. When you move from the cauliflower rice to the cooked cauliflower, you can again see that it's the same color and temperature, but it's a new, it's a new form of that food being cauliflower. And then again, moving into the last one listed of the raw cauliflower, you can see it's the same food, it's the same color, it's the same shape, but this time we are presenting it in a new form, being a different temperature and a different texture. So you can see how this can help get you from something like a pancake to maybe an end goal of cauliflower, and you can do this at home. It does take a little bit more forethought and planning for you as the parent to begin kind of thinking through how these connections happen. You can't just arbitrarily, and sitting with a child, start to kind of throw ideas out and immediately make those connections. But I encourage you to kind of start thinking about that when you're eating with your child. Maybe, as you're starting to change the shape, then you can think, what other foods do we know that are in the shape of a half moon? Let's think. And you can begin brainstorming, because you sitting there and inviting that conversation, that dialogue with your child might invite another opportunity for another food chain to maybe say the next day you do a pancake and a tortilla. So where the feeding therapists at Our Table Eating in Color do this in a therapy session all in one sitting to kind of connect the dots between all of these, that may or may not be realistic for you at home. I would encourage, if you do choose to do something like this, there are a lot of different examples out there of food hierarchies, or as I mentioned, this as a resource, you can go to their page and see a lot of different examples done too. But you might dedicate, one snack time a week where you're going to learn to like something new in this fashion. And you might set aside, 15 to 20 minutes to sit with your child and help them to draw these connections, because most kids will not see the connections between these foods as you roll out one to the next. If you have a pancake and then you cut it in half to a half pancake, or you bring out a half pancake and then you bring out a half tortilla and things, your child's going to wonder what's going on. So I would invite this to be a very engaging opportunity with your child if you choose to do something more robust like this at home, as you develop a little bit more comfort and confidence in how to go about food chaining. But it can be done in the home setting as well if you feel ready and equipped to do so. Or if you are working with a feeding therapist, you can also ask them for ideas of food chains that you might be able to work on at home to supplement those that they're doing in therapy. So whether you decide that you're eager and ready to start going with a more robust example like the one I just shared, or you want a more simple starting place like the one I shared right before that, I want you to aim to change one thing at a time with the known qualifiers for your child's Love It list. And with this, I want you to kind of think of one change that you're going to make to that food is one link on the chain for your child. You can make long food chains like the one that I just shared, or you can make shorter food chains with fewer links, and that's okay too, because you can continue to build upon these as links are added to the chain. It doesn't all need to be done at one time. Of course, you expose your child to more options when more links are done in one chain at a given time, but that is not needed. And again, your discretion should be how your child responds to this and how you yourself feel going into this. If the latter example with 9 different options being offered is very overwhelming to you, just start small and look at how can you change the shape, how can you change the color, how can you change the taste, the texture, or the temperature. Going back to one of the examples given before in this module of encouraging you to choose one of the least nutrient dense Love It foods for your child. Again, not starting with whole yogurt, but instead, picking something like a goldfish or a pretzel for your child would be the more ideal place to start, so that you're not potentially messing with a food that they have as a Love It food that provides a lot of nutrition to their diet. So I shared some examples here about how you might change the shape, the color, the taste, the texture, or the temperature to these given items. So for your homework in this module, I want you to go ahead and start thinking through how can you make steps to add new links to the chain. What would the next step be? It might be that at first, again, as I mentioned before, shape and color can be some of the easier ones for most kids to receive. So the first step for you might just be buying or preparing or offering a different shape or color. Again, that could go to the brand if the packaging seems to be the shape or the color that your child's responding to. And you might make a change to that, and you might just buy a different item. That might be step 1 on trying to food chain your child's given Love It food. Step 2 might be to keep the texture of the item the same, but to get a different taste of that. And step 3 could be that you have the same taste, but now maybe you're buying an item that's a different texture. We'll go through examples of all of this, but I want you to understand for a homework how-to, how to begin kind of making your food chaining next steps based off this, this resource. This resource is modified from one from Catherine Callahan, who's a speech language pathologist over at Chi Kids Feeding. I'll also link to her in the suggested resources because she's a great resource for food chaining and any of the things that might be topics of interest with a speech language pathologist, similar to how Melanie also helped us in this area. So I'll link to her in the suggested resources if that might also be helpful. So to show you some homework how-to of how you can go about doing this with your child's Love It food, I want to compare on this slide and the next some steps versus some strides. Again, as I mentioned and as I highlighted when I showed you my combination cards, some kids are going to be receptive to much larger strides with food chaining and being able to connect a lot of links in one short food chain. Other children will need much smaller steps, and they'll need much more subtle changes for them not to care. So when we look at make changes that are large enough to notice, small enough not to care, some kids are going to care more about small steps. And so to give you two examples of kind of what steps would look like versus larger strides that might be too big for some kids, I want to go ahead and walk you through a common kid favorite that was on the menu in week 5. In each weekly menu idea, I share with you some different variations. Again, this comes down to food chaining, which hopefully you're starting to observe that that's how this all works. But the concept is there each week in the weekly menu so that you begin to see how could I offer different variations of this given food. And so in the example of mac and cheese, which again was talked about in the module 5 menu, you can begin to see what steps could you make to gradually make little changes to this food. So if your child has a preferred type of mac and cheese, you might first just look at changing the shape of the noodle. For some kids, that can be a huge deal. And again, if it's large enough for them to notice, but small enough for them not to care, the shape is the only difference. As parents, it's very easy to want to reason with them and to justify it is literally the exact same. We talked about this too in module 5 of when we look at Love-It foods and them being seemingly the exact same, but to our child, they're not. Again, if we can see our children as detectives who are detecting every difference that's with that food, we need to realize something as visually apparent as a change in shape is going to alert them something is different. They don't necessarily know that the taste and the texture is the same or different yet. So that's why if we can change just one thing at a time and not change the taste, the texture, the temperature, the shape, the color all at once our child is receptive to this new shape and is willing to eat it to see, oh, this is actually pretty on par with what I ate before. It does taste the exact same. It's just a different shape. Then we can begin to go to step 2, where we change another element, another characteristic, another qualifier. And that might be something like the same, you're still buying the same brand, you now have a different shape, but now maybe say you're choosing the white cheese packet versus the orange cheese packet. And that would make a different taste to it. It would also change the color. So again, kind of think of how each change that you're making, how many changes does that really yield if it changes a few of them at once. So if you didn't want to change the color, maybe you think I'm still going to use the orange cheese packet, but this time I want to see if I can mix in Greek yogurt instead of the milk, or maybe instead of the milk and butter, make it creamy that way, see if they notice. And that would keep the color the same, but it would slightly change the taste just a little bit. So that might be what you would do step 2. The third step you could do would be to maybe add some freshly grated cheese so it kind of melts into it. That adds a different texture, especially if you're using like a boxed mac and cheese that has a powdered cheese packet. Having kind of that creamy melted cheese texture in the mac and cheese is not something that they're familiar with, and likely is one of the qualifiers in their favored food if their Love-It list qualifiers was boxed mac and cheese. So you can see how this would add a little bit different texture. Maybe you start out with really finely grated cheese and just a little bit. Over time, you can maybe add a little bit more. Again, is my end goal for your child to be an aficionado of mac and cheese? No, it is not. But you can see with this, you might be able to start ultimately as you link more and more links in the chain, you might be able to food chain towards a family meal where you make a one pot noodle dish where they're able to tolerate lots of different proteins or veggies or cheese and different elements all in one, because you are willing to alter and adjust that initial starting place and use all the links on the chain to get to that end goal of maybe a more nutritionally well balanced pasta dish that would have some of the resemblance to maybe say a mac and cheese with grated cheese that has a little bit more texture to it than the one that they're used to. So let's talk about what would be a stride. Notice on the worksheet for this week's homework, I am not mentioning strides 1, stride 2, stride 3. I'm encouraging steps. Most children are going to do the best with food chaining when it's done in small steps, such as that suggested on the last slide. Some kids, especially those who are a little bit more adventurous and maybe have I should say a little bit more adventurous of eaters and maybe have fewer qualifiers for their given Love-It foods, may be more receptive to bigger changes. However, I would caution you, because I think quickly as I run through this example, you'll see, wow, that is a big leap. My child is probably not ready to make a stride that large. But, and that's kind of where the example of the combination cards come in. It helps you see what maybe a bigger food chain might be. Some of the variations suggested on combination cards are very small and subtle, and some of them are a little bit bigger, particularly as you get into changing taste and texture, because as we talked about even with the boxed mac and cheese, as you change taste and texture with a food, it often changes a lot of the other elements too. It often will end up changing the color as well, and things like that. So we want to think of, you know, what changes our child is going to be receptive to and be able to kind of work through. So if your child loves mac and cheese, you might, and this is suggested also in the Module 5 menu, you know, you might try working towards a lentil-based noodle. And again, a little bit more nutrition here. We're making it a little bit more nutritionally dense and as an option, but that might be still changing a lot for your child because now it's a new brand, it's a new box. So they're packaging wise, they're already alerted to something is different here. But instead of this is a new shape only, but it's still the same exact taste and texture of pasta, now it's maybe this noodle shape is different. Maybe that was elbow and you just jumped straight to the shell of a lentil-based pasta. Well, that is changing the shape, potentially changing the color, and the taste and texture of lentil-based pasta is different. And so if your child is up for a stride like that, you're welcome to try it. But if it quote unquote fails for you, also recognize maybe that was too big of a stride. Maybe you need to make smaller steps and instead take the example shared on the last slide and make some small steps that lead you in the direction of your child being willing to tolerate a lentil-based pasta through putting together a few links in the chain that might help connect you from where you're starting to a lentil-based pasta. But for the sake of this example, you might see how you could do a lentil-based pasta in there. And then maybe instead of the original cheese packet, you begin doing an Alfredo sauce instead of, you know, say the powdered packet of cheese that comes in box noodles. And so that you're giving them a similar texture in terms of like kind of a creamy cheese. Again, little detectives who are highly detective, they might notice there's a lot of difference in the texture between a powdered packet of mac and cheese and a maybe pre-made jarred Alfredo sauce. But they're similar in texture, but the taste is again going to be different. With that, you can see how we would leverage this into maybe being able to take it to the direction of adding veggies or chicken to make it a broccoli and chicken, you know, Alfredo pasta dinner. And the changes that you make over time to get to this. Again, it is completely normal if your child needs several links in the chain to get from step 1 to 2 or 2 to 3 here. But you can see over time how each of these changes, each of these steps that we are willing to help facilitate for our child can help facilitate for them growth opportunities where they begin to become more comfortable with the newness of different foods from those that they already know that they love. So with this, we can see that each child and each given Love It food is going to yield a different reply from our kids. Each of us in the Academy have unique kids with unique Love It lists and even more unique qualifying lists of what qualifies as a food that they will love and enjoy. Some items we may be able to make greater strides with, but for the most part, especially depending on where each of our children fall on the picky eating continuum, we want to expect that our child is more likely than not needing to take baby steps versus strides. However, the outcomes that we see with strides we can still get to, it's just going to take us more baby steps to get there. So in order to be successful as possible with food chaining, I want you to consider a few of these reminders. First of which I already mentioned, be sure that you're starting with one of the least nutritious Love It foods on their list. Do not change all your child's Love It foods at once. Instead, if a food is currently providing the bulk of your child's nutrition, make sure that you are not choosing that as your first option. We need that to stay as a safe food. Instead, I want you to choose one that they enjoy, but they aren't leaning on daily as a predominant or heavy source of their nutrition. Additionally, I want you to value the slow, small changes that promote success. This drives home the importance of being able to make progress gradually, even if it's not necessarily in the stride that sometimes that we might hope for. And I want with this you to also be receptive and responsive that if your child struggles with the way that you offer it, consider if and how you could make the change even smaller or how you could help guide them in that change. As I mentioned with the suggested resources, I would encourage you to check some of these out as they help walk you through some of the language that you can use and some of the ways that you can help talk to your child about these changes in very no pressure ways that help just position these foods to highlight the strengths and the similarities of them in ways that highlight those qualifying factors rather than make your child kind of freeze at the sight of something that's different to them. Additionally, with this, I want you to consider how you can learn as you go. Remember that this can take off whatever your direction your child shows interest in and is positive about, which can be fun, but also different from the way we kind of perceive it going as parents. So make sure just to be willing to go with the process as your child leads it. Additionally, I encourage you to recognize which foods are more challenging and take more time to introduce. These could be foods like meats that are often tough for kids to eat, or things like vegetables, or fruits that may have multiple textures going on, or like the fruits that burst in their mouth or create an unexpected texture when they eat it. These foods are very common for children to struggle with eating. So I would not expect one of your first successes in food chaining to be to get your child to eat a raw vegetable or a raw fruit or some meat at dinner as one of the first successes when they're just starting to get oriented with their Love-It foods being adapted into a new form. Additionally, we all know that as we've discussed in Module 5 with the Love-It foods, kids' temperaments going into meals and snacks can have a big impact on how they eat and how the entire meal goes in general. So for the same reasons as how we want to position meal times, we also want to think about when our children are going to be more apt to engage and enjoy a new food versus melt down at the table, even if it was a Love-It food. So make sure to be in tune with that and try and avoid times that your child might be excessively tired or cranky or just over anything, even if it was a Love-It food, so that the experience that you guys are having and that the exposure to this food change, new food, is as positive one as possible.